Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Communications Director for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our entire staff, our President, Mark Melman, our Board of Co-Chairs, Ann Lewis and Todd Richmond, whom I know are with us today, welcome. We hope that you and your loved ones are in good spirits and are staying well and healthy. Before I turn it over to our board member, Archie Gottesman, to introduce our distinguished guest, I wanted to go over a couple of items. I think you can see on your screen how to follow us on social media. If you like what you hear today, please do consider giving us a follow on Twitter or Facebook. Like us on Facebook. You can also follow us on Instagram. You can also go to our website, dmfi.org, and sign up for our news and updates and alerts. We'll also take questions today. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom account. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can type in a question right on the comments box there. With that, I'm going to turn it over to DMFI board member Archie Gottesman. Archie?
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, I'm Archie Gottesman, and today is my really distinct honor to introduce Ritchie Torres. So Ritchie was born and raised in the Bronx in New York City public housing. He always had a dream of fighting for his community and in hopes of building a better Bronx. So at age 24, which is insanely young, he became the youngest elected official in New York City and the first openly LGBT elected official from the Bronx. In November 2017, Ritchie was then elected to his second term, where he had a number of legislative victories before launching his run for Congress just about a year ago. So Ritchie proudly describes himself as the embodiment of a pro-Israel progressive. He has also said that the BDS movement against Israel poisons whatever it touches and is an insidious form of anti-Semitism. And I just want to say, when I see Ritchie speak, like, I'm on the board of DMFI. I'm involved in Israel stuff. Like, I do a lot of Jewish things. When I first heard Ritchie speak about Israel, I just had never heard anything like it. I was like, I've heard a million people talk about this, but when he spoke, he does it. It's more than speaking. He feels it with such grace and such knowledge and such honor that it was actually Ritchie, I never told you this, I was actually so nervous to meet you because I felt like, oh my gosh, it was just so beautiful and almost, not otherworldly, but amazing the way you speak with such honesty and conviction about Israel, U.S.-Israel relations and everything about that. It really is, I just wish that we could clone you so there were a million Ritchies running around talking about Israel. Anyway, we are looking forward to Ritchie heading to Washington, making history as the first LGBTQ Afro-Latino person elected to the U.S. Congress, and being a friend and a strong Israel progressive voice on Capitol Hill. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and please welcome me in welcoming Ritchie Torres. So, thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. You set expectations so high, I worry I'm destined to disappoint.
You got it, man. You just do.
But so I'll make a few preliminary comments, and then I'd be happy to answer whatever questions the audience might have. You know, I have a deep love of Israel and what Israel represents. For me, it embodies the triumph of human ingenuity. It's remarkable to see what Israel's accomplished in the span of little more than 7 decades. It's really a reminder that humanity has the capacity to overcome the greatest of struggles and to build something that is a wonder to behold. And my experiences in Israel remain among the most formative in my life. And, you know, I worry, as many of you do, about the creeping anti-Semitism in American politics, in politics throughout the world. You know, I often point out that one need not be Jewish or Israeli to see clearly the double standard, the anti-Semitic double standard against Israel. It's the only country on the face of the earth targeted for both delegitimation and destruction. And I often wonder, why is there only a BDS movement against Israel? There's no BDS movement against China, which is detaining more than 1 million Muslims. There's no BDS movement against Myanmar, which is committing ethnic cleansing against Rohingya Muslims. There's no BDS movement against Iran, which is the leading sponsor of terrorism in the world, there's only a BDS movement against Israel. And if the selective delegitimation is not explained by anti-Semitism, what explains it? And I've never heard a remotely satisfactory answer to that question. You know, I've been to Israel on 2 occasions, first in 2015, and then in 2018 during the 70th anniversary. And as a kid, I was too poor to travel. So the first time I ever actually went outside the United States was when I went to Israel. And, you know, I had no real knowledge of Israel or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so when I announced that I was going on a delegation to Israel, to my astonishment, I became the target of hate and harassment, both in person and online. There were Twitter accounts and press conferences accusing me of pinkwashing, which is a term I had never heard before. I was targeted simply because I was an LGBTQ Afro-Latino supporter of Israel. And, you know, in a publication known as The Jewish Insider, I recount an experience of approaching an LGBTQ supporter of BDS. And I asked this supporter, you know, what do you think of Hamas? And I will never forget what she said to me. She said that Hamas is standing for the liberation of the Palestinian people. And at that moment, I wondered to myself, how could an LGBTQ activist defend an organization that systematically and savagely murders LGBTQ people? And over time, I came to realize that the BDS movement uses a distorted notion of intersectionality to spread anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism in a whole range of progressive movements. You know, I like to draw a distinction between the original understanding of intersectionality, which I support, and the distortion of intersectionality, which I oppose. You know, the original understanding of intersectionality held that the intersections of your identity matter, right? That I'm an Afro-Latino, I'm both Black and Latino. My experience of life as an Afro-Latino is different from someone who's simply Latino or different from someone who's simply Black, and the intersections of our identity create a distinct lived experience, a distinct identity. That strikes me as an entirely sensible idea. The BDS movement takes that idea and radically reinterprets it to mean that you cannot be both progressive and pro-Israel. And I see myself as living proof that that is a vicious lie. You know, I'm Afro-Latino, I'm LGBTQ, I'm from the Bronx, I'm millennial, I'm progressive, and I'm pro-Israel. And I reject the notion that you cannot be both progressive and pro-Israel. You know, the worst manifestation of this was there were several Dyke marches, Pride marches in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. that prohibited members of the pro-Israel Jewish community from waving a flag featuring the Star of David, which is not simply anti-Israel sentiment, that's just pure, undisguised anti-Semitism. And I found that striking because the purpose of a pride parade is to take pride in who you are, is to empower people to embrace who they are. And yet, if you're a member of the pro-Israel Jewish community, the message to you is that you have to be ashamed rather than proud of who you are. You have to be in the closet rather than open about your support for Israel. And that to me is not pride, that's a perversion of pride. That's not progressivism, that's a perversion of progressivism. And so I see it as my personal mission to prevent the perversion of progressivism at the hands of the BDS movement, which to me is an insidious form of anti-Semitism. And we're living in a volatile political moment in which there's a real risk that the BDS movement could move from the fringes of American politics to the mainstream of American politics. And what we need is a democratic majority for Israel, but we don't need a silent majority. We don't need a faint-hearted majority. You know, those of us who are supporters of Israel need to be visible and vocal, need to be fearless and forceful in our advocacy for Israel as a Jewish state, in our advocacy for the Israeli-American relationship, and in our advocacy for a two-state solution as the best path for peace. and in our advocacy against anti-Semitism in every form, no matter where it comes from, whether it's from the far right or the far left. And so I look forward to serving as a model of pro-Israel progressivism in an age of political volatility. I feel like I'm the right person at this moment to represent the next generation of pro-Israel pragmatic progressive leadership in Washington, D.C. And I can keep bloviating as politicians typically do, but I think that captures the value that I hope to add to progressive politics nationwide.
Thanks, Ritchie. I'll start with questions, but first I wanted to remind everyone to please, if you have a question for Ritchie, please submit it through the Q&A feature here on Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook, you can type it into the comments box. Ritchie, I'll start. You had a very competitive primary. Some people maybe counted you out. What worked? How'd you get to where you are?
Oh, God. I ran in the most fiercely contested primary in New York City. There were 12 candidates, including 5 elected officials, a former speaker, a vice chair of the DNC, a candidate endorsed by AOC herself, and a man by the name of Ruben Diaz Sr., who has the most powerful name in Bronx politics. Ruben Diaz Sr. has a reputation as the most anti-LGBTQ, anti-choice, pro-Trump elected official in New York City politics. And there was a risk that a pro-Trump Republican masquerading as a Democrat could represent the most Democratic district in America. And the political pundits largely said that the race could not be won and that Ruben Diaz Sr. could not be beaten. And against all odds, we defeated Ruben Diaz Sr. with the in-person vote by a margin of 2-1. And I defeated a pro-BDS candidate by a margin of 3-1. And, you know, I would argue the most important variables determining the outcome of an election is the quality of the candidate and the quality of the campaign. And I felt like I was a strong candidate who ran a strong campaign. We were effective at managing our resources. We spent most of our resources in the final weeks when voter contact matters. And our operating principle is every dollar not spent on voter contact is a waste. We prioritized contact with voters through television, through mail, through social media. We would have done more face-to-face, door-to-door campaigning were it not for COVID-19. And I think part of the reason I won was for 2 reasons. One, you know, this was an election unfolding against the backdrop of COVID-19 and the mass demonstrations following the killing of George Floyd. So it became a change election, and I emerged as the change candidate. And what began as a wide open race of 12 candidates crystallized into a 2-person contest between Ruben Diaz Sr., who represented more of the same, and myself, who represented an infusion of new energy in Bronx politics. And the voters of the South Bronx overwhelmingly cast their ballot for me as the representative of a new generation of leadership in the South Bronx. And then part of it was my personal story. People saw themselves in me. You know, I grew up almost all my life in poverty in the Bronx, and the South Bronx is the poorest congressional district in America. I was raised by a single mother who had to raise 3 children on minimum wage, which in the 1990s was $4.25. Right? I grew up in public housing, living in conditions of mold and mildew, leaks and lead, without reliable heat and hot water in the winter. And so I know the struggles of the South Bronx because I've lived them in my own life. And many of the voters who decided to vote for me saw themselves and their struggles and their highest hopes and aspirations embodied in my candidacy. So that in a nutshell is why I think I won. Well, we'll likely win. Not every ballot has been counted, but we've established a lead that is so overwhelming that I've been presumed to be the Democratic nominee.
Here's a question from Howard Weiser. Any suggestions for the pro-Israel community as to what else we can do to make our case to the progressive community?
Well, first, we have to, pro-Israel progressives and the pro-Israel community writ large, we have to be careful not to cede political organizing and academia to the pro-BDS extremes of the progressive movement. We have to create spaces that allow people to be both progressive and pro-Israel. And for me, the model is Zioness, which was founded by my friend Amanda Berman. We need more Zionesses in the political arena, and we need more Zionesses in our institutions of higher learning. When people ask me, why do you have such a common sense view on Israel? And I said, because I dropped out of college. So I was never indoctrinated. And that's partly meant as a joke, but it's partly a serious observation that the pro-BDS indoctrination, in my opinion, begins in our institutions of higher learning and increasingly is trickling down to the high school level. And so there needs to be a counterbalance modeled after Zionist. I feel like Amanda Berman is onto something that should be replicated more widely.
Great. Ritchie, here's a question. As you're well aware, some members of Congress and in our party are quite critical or even openly hostile to Israel. What will your approach be to working with them?
Look, first, I would draw a clear distinction between constructive criticism and delegitimation, right? Like the greatest myth in American politics is that we have a political culture that inhibits criticism of Israel. I think everyone here would agree that constructive criticism of Israel's policies is fair game. Constructive criticism of any government's policies is fair game, right? But it's one thing to be critical of a government's policies and practices. It is something else to delegitimize the state of Israel itself. And just like it is possible to be critical of the Trump administration without delegitimizing the United States, it should be possible to be critical of the Netanyahu administration without delegitimizing Israel. There has to be a clear distinction drawn between constructive criticism, which is fair game, and delegitimation, which is beyond the pale. And what is often directed toward Israel is not constructive criticism, it's pure hate. And I've seen it firsthand. It is in my nature to have a working relationship with all my colleagues, despite passionate differences of opinion on policy. The United States is a pluralistic society, and Congress is a microcosm of American pluralism. And when you're in a pluralistic collegial institution, you need to have working relationships with everyone. If you and I agree 95% of the time, we should collaborate 95% of the time. If we only agree 5% of the time, we should collaborate 5% of the time. And in my mind, it's certainly possible to passionately fight for the things that you care about while forging relationships with people whose views are different from your own. If you treat your colleagues with disrespect and disdain, then you're going to undercut your effectiveness as a legislator, especially in an institution like Congress, where relationships matter. So I reject the mindset of intolerance, which says that if you disagree with me, you're not only wrong, but you're evil. Even if I passionately denounce what you stand for, I try to the extent possible, and it's not always possible. I try to see the good in everyone. I try to see the humanity in everyone. And I try to articulate what I think is a progressive case for Israel as a Jewish state. And I think that will make me more effective rather than resorting to character assassination.
Ritchie, here's another question from Jake McClory. There's a storyline out there put out by Republicans that grassroots Democrats are turning against Israel. You campaigned as a pro-Israel candidate. Do you think that hurt you? Did you get pushback from voters?
The answer is complicated. So I'll distinguish the outside game from the inside game, right? The outside game refers to the support that you attract outside your district, the institutional support, and the inside game refers to the support that you attract within your district from the voters themselves. It certainly had some impact on the outside game, and some of it was self-imposed. Like, I made a pledge early on that I would not seek to support, like, if you believe, as I do, that BDS is a form of anti-Semitism, then in my mind, it logically follows that I should never seek the support of an organization that embraces any form of anti-Semitism. So I made an early pledge early on that I would not seek the support of an organization like the Democratic Socialists of America, and that made me a powerful enemy. And the DSA candidate in my race relentlessly demonized me. But that was a choice that I made. Within the district, it was largely irrelevant because all politics is local. You know, the Bronx is the poorest congressional district in America. What matters to the voters of the South Bronx is health and housing, schools and jobs. And the candidate who speaks most powerfully to those issues is well positioned to win. So I'm living proof that you can be an unabashedly pro-Israel progressive and win competitive races. I happen to think that integrity is not only good morals, it's also good politics. Like, voters reward authenticity, voters reward integrity.
Here's a question from Meshulam. How do you build a new generation of pro-Israel progressive candidates across the country, say like how AOC has with the Justice Democrats?
I mean, you need to build institutions. The institutional left is extraordinarily effective at recruiting candidates and training them and fundraising for them and building a whole infrastructure around them. The pragmatic progressive wing of the party needs to create its own infrastructure to recruit candidates, to fundraise for them, to provide them with institutional memory and expertise. What is desperately needed is infrastructure, right? If you're like a pro-BDS leftist, there's a whole industrial complex that exists to support you. But if you are pragmatic pro-Israel Democrat, you're often left to your own devices. And so there needs to be an infrastructure that supports a pragmatic alternative to the extremes.
Here's a question from Ritchie Torres, a board member. We heard from her a little bit earlier. How have you successfully been able to make an anti-Israel person see that Israel is being held to radically different standards than other places, and that it's a positive country?
Look, it is hard to overcome the decades of indoctrination, but there's no, if you single out Israel for delegitimation, if you single out Israel for boycotts and divestment and sanctions, how do you explain that by anything other than anti-Semitism, right? And no one wants to be accused of singling out, because it seems inconsistent. It seems like a double standard that you cannot justify. But I'm under no illusion that I'm going to persuade the most fanatically anti-Israel forces. I often divide the left into two categories. There's the democratic socialist, who tend to be fanatically anti-Israel. And then there are progressives, among whom views on Israel vary widely. And those are the persuadables. My message to them is we should be able to engage in constructive criticism of any country's policies without delegitimizing the state itself, right? Drawing that distinction between constructive criticism and delegitimation is critical in my mind.
Actually, I wanted to ask a little bit more about your background.
I would also say go to Israel.
Yeah.
By the way, and because many of the critics have no real empathy for the unique security situation of Israel and the unique plight of the Jewish people. Learn some history, go to Israel. It is qualitatively different from the experience here in the United States. We are guarded by oceans, right? We have the most powerful military in the world, right? Israel's surrounded by hostile neighbors and enemies, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or ISIS and all the rest. Not to mention the extent of Iranian influence and tentacles in destabilizing the region. So I think before you judge Israel, you have to place it in context and understand the unique security challenges. So I once heard an author say that there's no such thing as a two-state solution, there's a two-state situation. And I love that phrase because it captures the complexity of what Israel faces.
Great. Can we talk a little bit more about the U.S.-Israel relationship, and when you're in Congress, what kind of opportunities for cooperation do you imagine or potentially see there?
Look, Israel has the most innovation per capita in the world. There was a book written, even though Israel is on the driest land on earth, it has emerged as a water superpower, a leader in desalination technology. So we can benefit from Israel's expertise on desalination technology. I remember coming across a report indicating that the relationship between New York City and Israel has been a multi-billion-dollar stimulus to the New York City economy. So there's a real economic dimension to the relationship, but I think of the Israeli-American relationship first and foremost as a friendship. I love the Aristotelian term friendship of virtue, which Aristotle distinguishes from friendships of pleasure or friendships of utility. You know, I'm friends with you not because of what I can get from you, but because of who you are. And the United States is friends with Israel first and foremost because of what Israel represents, right? Everything else is secondary, right? It's a friendship built first and foremost on common values. And when you go to Israel, it has a recognizably democratic character to it. Like I, as an American, feel at home in Israel because it has values that resemble my own.
Here's a question from our board co-chair, Todd Richmond. Thank you for your positive energy about politics and your support for the U.S.-Israel relationship. You ran the most democratic district in the nation and beat badly a pro-BDS-backed Justice Democratic candidate, which shows, as you said, all politics is local. When you arrive in Congress, what committee will you seek out? Will you think about the Foreign Affairs Committee? You'll be a great and needed voice on so many things in addition to the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Look, I have an open mind. I mean, first I have to wait for every ballot to be counted. And then once the election is certified, you know, I'm not one to celebrate. It's in my nature to get to work, to build a team, both in the district office and the legislative office, to meet with seasoned hands so that I can gain insight into the workings of DC. You know, I'm here to humbly learn from those who know far more than I do. As far as committees, the two committees that would seem most interesting to me are financial services, because it has jurisdiction over housing, and foreign affairs, because I have a deep interest in geopolitics. But I have an open mind, and these decisions are largely beyond my control. I suspect leadership will ultimately decide what committees are assigned to me.
Ritchie, I want to ask a little bit more about your background and experiences growing up as a member of the LGBTQ community and as an Afro-Latino. How have your views been informed?
I mean, all of us are a product of who we are and what we believe and value. We're all products of our identities and lived experiences. As an Afro-Latino, I'm much more sensitive to racism. As an LGBTQ person, I'm much more sensitive to homophobia. When I won elected office in 2013, I became the first openly LGBTQ elected official from the Bronx, and I felt a particular obligation to advocate for the LGBTQ community in the Bronx and LGBTQ communities of color throughout the state. You know, the Bronx had no real support structure. And so as a council member, I secured millions of dollars to establish an LGBTQ senior center in every borough. I persuaded the Department of Homeless Services to create a shelter specifically for LGBTQ youth who were experiencing violence in the traditional shelter system. We passed a law requiring the city to create a mental health plan specifically oriented toward LGBT elders and LGBT seniors who have distinctive mental health needs. So, you know, those policy priorities were driven by my identity, my lived experience as an LGBTQ person. A favorite quote of mine is, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably going to be on the menu. And as you know, I'm on the verge of becoming the first LGBTQ Afro-Latino member of Congress in the United States. And I'm going to allow my lived experience to inform my policy priorities in Congress.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the racial justice movement in this country.
Sure.
What are some ways do you believe we can address the systematic racism in our country?
Look, for me, the solution is not abolition. The right A word is accountability. Like in most workplaces in America, if you engage in misconduct, you are held accountable. Right? Officers who commit misconduct, who abuse their power, should be held accountable. Right? Daniel Pantaleo choked Eric Garner to death. He was caught on film doing so. And not only was he not held accountable, he received a pay increase. He had a 6-figure salary. And only after public pressure, it took 5 years to fire him. That is unacceptable. So, my basic position is as long as there is no accountability, there will never be an end to police brutality, right? If officers are never punished or prosecuted for abusing their power, then there's no incentive for restraint. There's no incentive for de-escalation. So for me, accountability for all has to be the cornerstone of a fair and just criminal justice system. All right-minded people condemn civilians who do violence to officers, and all right-minded people should condemn officers who do unjustified violence to civilians. But here's the problem. I am confident that civilians who do violence to officers will be held accountable. I am not so confident that officers who do unjustified violence to civilians, even when caught on camera, will face the same kind of accountability. And therein lies the double standard that has shaken public confidence in the criminal justice system. So that's a double standard that we have to rectify. We have to create an independent system for investigating, punishing, and if necessary, prosecuting police misconduct. No government agency, including a police department, can be trusted to police itself. So accountability for all. If I were to sum it up in a hashtag, accountability for all. That's my vision for rooting out systemic racism.
A question from a supporter. The Jewish and African American communities have done so much important work together, particularly on civil rights. What can we do to strengthen the ties between
Rachel, I didn't hear you earlier, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, sure. We have a question from a supporter about civil rights. The Jewish and African American communities have worked so closely and done so much important work together on civil rights. What can we do now, today, to strengthen the ties between the Jewish and African American community?
I think it's about, champion causes that matter to the African American community, like criminal justice reform, like police reform, which is something Zionist has done, and forge relationships with African American leaders. Like the Black church remains a fixture in the African American community. There should be an attempt to forge, and I suspect there already is, deep ties between the Black church and the pro-Israel community, because there's common interest, and there should be relationships forged around those common values and common interests.
Great. I'm going to ask you a question about COVID, if that's okay.
Sure.
You'll be entering Congress in an unprecedented era given COVID. Have you given any thought to how to get up and running in this environment, and have you heard anything about it?
Look, my impression is that government via telecommuting is here to stay for the indefinite future. And to be honest with you, in the South Bronx, my district was struggling even before the outbreak of COVID-19. And after the outbreak, just the suffering has never run deeper. Just the level of food insecurity and housing insecurity is shocking. And so, like, after this call, I'm actually going to go to a local church in the Bronx to distribute food and PPE. That has been a huge part of my responsibility as an elected official, is to ensure that people in need get food, because families are struggling to survive or struggling to put food on the table. And for me, the greatest priority of the Democratic Party of this country should be to address the affordability crisis in the midst of COVID-19, just the cost of housing and healthcare and housing and higher education is imposing a massive burden on everyday families.
Ritchie, this was so great. We're so grateful for your time. We're very excited for you and to see what comes next. I'm going to hand it over to Mark Melman to wrap things up.
Wow, was that already an hour? God.
If there's more you want to say, feel free.
Oh, no. Brevity is the soul of wit. So.
Absolutely. But thank you very, very much. First, let me just acknowledge you mentioned your friend and ours, Amanda Berman, founder of Zionist, who I believe is on this call. If we were all in a meeting together, we'd all be applauding. But thank you, Amanda. I believe you're here. And if not, we missed you. If you are, we're delighted you're here. Second, I just want to say I had the opportunity to meet Ritchie back in the day when you could meet people in different cities, actually in a restaurant in New York City. And I've spent a lot of time with politicians over the last 35 years. Some have gone on to great things. Some have not gone on to great things. But rarely do you meet somebody, as I did with Ritchie, and walk away saying, this person is a superstar. And Ritchie Torres is a superstar. There is just no question about that. I hope you got a sense of that in his discussion with us this afternoon, whether he's talking about Israel or talking about police accountability or talking about hunger and homelessness, or talking about race. He thinks about these problems in a deep and sensitive way. His lived experience is part of who he is, and he communicates that so beautifully and so well. Again, he's a superstar, and we're so grateful for you. We're so grateful for your victory, putative possible victory, likely victory in this race. I should note that DMFI PAC, our sister organization, was active in the race with some digital advertising. One of the great things about digital advertising is you can measure it with some specificity. 528,000 views of our ad in the district by people who watched it in total, and it was 100% praise of Ritchie Torres, which he well deserved. And again, we're glad to have played a very small part in his victory. Altogether, DMFI PAC has had 17 wins so far this year. One apparent loss, one race still too close to call, but it's a great record that we're very proud of. DMFI, our Democratic Majority for Israel, our C4 organization, is hard at work, even as we speak, on trying to make sure that we have a democratic platform that remains pro-Israel, as it has been in the past. And Ritchie referred to that, but it's very important work that we're now very much in the midst of, and we'll continue our efforts to make sure that we advance the interests of the Democratic Party and that Democratic Party remains pro-Israel. Ritchie Torres will play a very substantial role in that general effort over time. And again, we're so grateful to you, Ritchie, so grateful for everything you've done, and look forward to being able to continue to work with you as you do even greater things in the months and years to come. So thank you all very much for being with us. Ritchie, thank you so much for your time and for your support.
Thank you. And at age 32, you're stuck with me for a long time.
Looking forward to it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.